First, I'd like to thank Diane for the opportunity to do this show, and of course, thank Mark for the opportunity to spend so much time with his work. I took a large format class, new camera class from Mark about 20 years ago, and we've been friends, and Mark's been the inspiration ever since. The inspiration for this show, the impetus for it, was my familiarity with work of Mark's that really hadn't had as much exposure as his landscape work and his architectural work. And I wanted to bring this more personal and quirky, these more personal and quirky images up for people to see. And it was a wonderful experience going through the portfolios and picking these out. Any preliminary thing you want to say?
No, just want to also thank Diane. It was, it was her idea to do, well, as far as I know, it was her idea. She approached me. Maybe you guys cooked it up together. And between them, they came up with the title of The Mystery of Everything, which I was really quite taken with, because I was trying to think of, for years I've been trying to think of an appropriate title for this vein of my work. Just to think about it. I wasn't thinking about a show. There were two titles that I really liked, but they were already taken. Ruth Bernhardt's book called The Gift of the Commonplace. That's a great title for this book, but it's taken. And then Lou Stuman, an Eastern photographer, had a book called Ordinary Miracles, which was even more to the point I was after. And I think The Mystery of Everything is in step with those, and it's, I'll claim it, thanks to you.
So, to be totally transparent, Mark and I had lunch a week ago or so to talk about what we would speak about spontaneously and under inhibition. But I'm going to throw a question at him that, to start off with, that didn't come up during that conversation. So, you can do it. I've spent a lot of time with these images over the last few months, and over that time, each one has become for me, has become an opening to a story, a memory, a meditation, or a philosophical meandering. As Diane recently wrote, the bare light bulb brings up a wealth of feelings and thoughts, far richer than its bare bones setting. Mark, does all this run through your head at the moment of capture? Or do you just let your eye lead you to where the image lurks, trusting that these other layers will reveal themselves in time?
Definitely don't think about it at the time. And I don't even trust that it will reveal itself later. Some of you have been in my classes, and I hand out these philosophical treatises that I come up with. So it seems like I do think about things a lot, and I do, but completely after the fact and with a different hat on, metaphorically speaking. When I'm photographing, when I'm just walking around, I just see things and they click, something clicks. And so sometime in the early 90s, I just decided to always have a camera with me. Because prior to that, I pretty much used a large camera on a tripod. And it's hard to be real spontaneous with that. Sort of like Woody Allen's character in Take the Money and Run, playing cello in a marching band. Being spontaneous with a view camera is sort of like that. It doesn't work. But just carrying a camera around with me, and many of these were done with just a camera I happened to have with me. Before phones were cameras. These are just about all done with film. I think the only one that's not done with film is this one. But anyway, no, I don't think about any of that stuff when I'm shooting. It's just, if something grabs my eye and it excites me, I photograph it, and then every step of the way, developing the film, I hold the negatives up, it shoots, rolls, and the editing process is, as long as that excitement continues, I go further with it. The prints, the bulk of the prints Michael looked through that select this show are from boxes and boxes of prints that I call my sketchbook, which is a lot of you who are photographers or know photographers, you're aware of proof sheets or proof prints. I don't make proof prints or proof sheets because they're just not good enough to see what's really there. So I devoted a lot of time and effort to giving the sketchbook, which basically a 1 each 5x7 print. Started 8x10, but as it got more voluminous, I felt like they were scaled it down. So it's mostly 5x7. One good print, and good print, you know, they weren't exhibition quality prints, but they were close. I could get it in 1 or 2 tries. And then when I go to make a print that you see on the wall here, I really work as long and as hard on it as I had to. So these sketchbook prints, I had boxes and boxes, and there are probably several thousand prints in those boxes. Several sessions, Michael went through them all and culled through for what he thought would make a good group. I thought it was great. I loved watching him go through it because the sketchbook was really for me, just so that years down the line I could see things I might have missed at the time. And it's the only time I put the negative index number on the back of the print, because the purpose of the sketchbook was, as I anticipated, as I was developing it, was to be able to go back and then find a negative and print it. But with 3 file cabinets full of negatives, if you don't have a physical address for that negative, it can be very frustrating and time-consuming, if not entirely futile. So the index numbers are there. So Michael would find a print and he'd jot down the index number, and then when you had the final selection, negatives that I hadn't scanned yet, I would scan so that we could make JPEGs and things for the show. And some of these are inkjet prints made from those scans, because I couldn't silver print everything. And I don't want to get into the mechanics of printing and that, but yeah, they're all identified in the carry-around sheet, the catalog that's several scattered around the room. So anyway, what I was getting at was that I do write these things that are kind of my attempt after the fact to understand what it is I'm doing. But it doesn't enter my mind when I'm shooting. When I'm shooting, it's just reacting. But reacting with a lot of practice. I've been doing it a long time, and I was doing it long before I was a photographer. Most of my memories of childhood and before I became a serious photographer are visual. And I have pictures in my head of things that have stuck. And maybe with artificial intelligence I can make some of these. The first one that I remember is sitting at Grattan School when I was first grade. First 10 minutes of lunch, everybody had to sit down on the benches lining the play yard, and they had to eat. Because they didn't have to eat, they wouldn't. And I guess the school didn't want to be responsible for malnourished kids. So you had to eat the first 10 minutes. I remember sitting there eating my Wonder Bread sandwich and looking up, and 360 degrees of kids with white squares in front of them. That's still in there. Yeah. And anyway, so that's...
One of the things that amazes me about the photos is that so many of them manage to become iconic without being nostalgic. And I think that's just such a feat to pull that off.
Well, I mean, I don't know what I would have done if photography didn't exist, or if I was born before 1839. Because like I said, the way I react to the world is visual, and I can't draw. Maybe I'd have worked a little harder at it if that was my only choice, but I don't think it would have taken, because I really can't draw. So, what was the question?
It really wasn't a question. Let's talk for a little moment about technical things. There's a diversity of different print media in the show. There's gelatin silver prints, there's platinum palladium prints, and there's digital prints, all of which have the quality of Mark's printing, which is he's an extraordinary printer. Um, the printing process aside, how do you feel like your way of photographing has changed over the course of the last 50 years?
Well, I think that the main thing that's happened, and the thing that I try to convey to my students is that for their own development, is that I've come to just trust my own vision. There's a part of me, and maybe there's the part of most people, that think, well, gee, if I saw that, everybody must see it. Or if it occurred to me, it must occur to everybody, and so there's no point in making a statement about it, because everybody realizes that. But I realize that's not the case. Everybody has their own take on things, and it takes, I don't want to get into psychology, but self-esteem and all this stuff. I had to let go of the notion that if it's occurred to me, it must have occurred to everybody. And that doesn't put any special status on what occurs to me, because everybody has things that occur to them. And in classes, I always use the analogy of that almost everybody has experienced in a work situation or school or with friends or whatever, where somebody says something that is not funny, not meant to be funny, and for most people's take is not funny, but it strikes you funny. I see a show of hands. That's happened to everybody. And if it happens at work or at school, you can't burst out laughing because everybody will be mad at you, your teacher or your boss or whoever. But what everybody, so you know that you have, for some quirky reason, your own take on things. And what I think is important for photographers is that when something grabs them, and I have a quote from Elliot Erwitt, one of the great photographers, that says, photography is simply a matter of noticing things. And there's a difference between seeing something and noticing something. Seeing is pretty universal. Your eyes scan, you see pretty much everything. But when you notice something, you sort of momentarily stop. And that has some meaning for you, for whatever reason. So if you trust that, and then have a medium like photography, you hone your craft to the point where that thing that grabbed your attention can be translated into a two-dimensional print, whether it's inkjet, silver, platinum, cyanotype, whatever. Then you've given voice to that thing that you've noticed. Not voice, you've given form to it. If I could draw, one of my sons can draw really beautifully. He'll see something and, man, how do you do that? It opens your eyes to something you have seen all the time but you've never noticed. And so a visual analog to that something striking you funny is pay attention to that. When something grabs your eye, and don't fall victim to the very easy mindset of, well, if I notice that, everybody must notice it, because that's just not the way it is. You're in that room, something struck you funny, didn't strike anybody else funny. So there you are. You got your individual take.
I think the other side of that is you see something that suddenly becomes meaningful to you, and rather than grabbing a camera and photographing it or drawing it right then, you say, well, what does that matter? If it's important to me, it doesn't matter. It's not worth wasting film over or time. So it's trusting your vision, and the images in this show, I think, are about finding that personal connection, that meaning, that opening into images that matter in places where no one would suspect they were lurking. Mark has done plenty of photographs of important places and places that other people find beautiful, and those are the ones we did not. That's the direction I did not want to go to in this show. There's a wonderful example on the corner around there, a photograph called Flexible Conduit, Aspen, Colorado, which is a great example of that, of making something memorable that maybe someone else wouldn't have noticed. And there's a little story about that.
Yeah, well, that's in a book. That's in the little softcover book of the catalog of the Monterey Museum Show. And shortly before she died, I visited Ruth Bernhardt and I showed her that catalog, and she always took a great. She was a great friend and inspiration. And she looked at it and she looks at that and it's identified Flexible Conduit, Aspen, Colorado, and she says, "It's perfectly obvious it's in Aspen. You don't need to put that in." Yeah, she could, and at that point in her life, she couldn't remember something she'd said 5 minutes before, and she'd repeat it, but she remembered everything that happened in the first class I took from her in 1970, and with everybody else that she'd met in her life. But she was, but her sense of humor, whatever her form of dementia was, it didn't touch her sense of humor. It's also kind of important, I think, to state that I never really had any aspiration to be an artist. It just never occurred to me. I mean, it didn't not occur to me, but it just was not in my sphere of reference. But seeing things was how I related to the world. And I started out with photography to be able to put what I saw and what excited me, what I saw, into tangible form. And then, as I realized photography was the perfect medium for this, I really fell in love with photography and studied it very hard for a long time and got very good at it. And then at some point in the last 20 years, I realized that I really don't care about photography anymore. I know how to do it, but I do care about transforming whatever it is I see into a photograph. So the photography that I learned during the period when I was actively in love with photography was very important, and I don't downplay that at all. But it doesn't matter to me anymore. So the fights over digital versus film, inkjet versus silver, they just don't matter. Edward Weston once said that, he says, "I don't care if you make a print on a bath mat as long as it's a good print." So, inkjet is my bath mat, and as long as it's a good print, I don't care. There are purists, and there's still that little vein in me that's a purist, and I sort of believe more in a darkroom print than I do an inkjet print. But that's just my own, talking about, that's a quirk. That's just unimportant to anybody but me and to those purists, and I don't care about the purists, their purist thoughts. It really doesn't matter to me.
So Mark, how many new silver gelatin prints did you make for this show?
For this show, 4. I wanted to make some. I still love the darkroom. I love the alchemy, and I still shoot film, even though I scan everything and then work with it in Lightroom, and that's my editing tool now. That's why I stopped the sketchbook, because I didn't really need that one good print anymore. I could do it in Lightroom and Photoshop, and in Photoshop's where I do most of the manipulation. Lightroom's where is the repository. And then from Lightroom to a print is 3 minutes. And everybody says you gotta calibrate your screen, your monitor, so that it comes out looking the way you see it on the screen. Well, it's never going to look like the way it does on the screen. It's the difference between a projected slide, which you're viewing by transmitted light, and a print, which is viewed by reflected light. They're never going to match. So with darkroom experience, the first print comes off the inkjet printer, and I said, "Oh, it's too dark. Well, what am I going to do? I'll have to recalibrate my screen." No, I'll just make a print light. I've never calibrated my monitor. I've had it for 14 years. And if the first print out of the printer doesn't look good, I tweak it and make another one. If that one doesn't look good, I tweak it again. And the nice thing about Lightroom is you can make a teeny little print and judge that without using a whole bunch of paper and a whole bunch of ink. And then when that looks good, say, okay, now I'll make it whatever size I want to make it.
To clarify, most of the images in the show are gelatin silver, and they're images that Mark had in his archive. There were some new images that had only been in the sketchbook and never printed beyond that. So those were the images that Mark printed just for this show. And some of those were digital, and 4 of those were a trip back to the
4 of them were
marker.
silver, and I wanted to do 5. This one right here at the phone booth, I could not get a good silver print of. I worked on it, and the paper I print on now, this is the curse of the age. The paper I print on now is long discontinued, and I've got very few sheets of it left. And I thought I could probably get a good silver print of that, but I don't want to use the amount of paper that it's going to take to do that. So, and maybe I wouldn't have been able to, because it's not a slam dunk. Can't always do it. So I was able to do it in Lightroom and Photoshop, and then just spit out a print that was perfect. Maybe the first one wasn't, but then I tweaked it, and it was great. So, you know, I really don't care ultimately whether it's inkjet or silver, but like I said, there's that little streak in me that my roots are in the darkroom, and I still love the alchemy of it. But it's the photograph that matters, not how it was made, physically made. The 2 silver prints, which are the ones on the right, one of them was made for this show, one of the what I call 2.5 domes, the 2 walnuts. That was made on the Czech paper, the Foma 532, which was discontinued about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm very carefully doling out what's left of it. But the one underneath it, of the 2 stools, is a vellum print, and vellum is my own term. I mean, it's not, I didn't invent the term vellum, but it's not actually printed on vellum. It's a kind of paper that Kodak made for many years that was very obscure even when they had it in production. And I know some of you in the room are familiar with it. And I had my own kind of proprietary toning procedure with it. And that's a vellum print, one of the stools. A couple more vellum prints, then a couple inkjet prints, vellum.
How long ago was the vellum discontinued?
The paper was discontinued in '94. And I sort of discovered it in 1992. And I just felt like, oh my God, I found the paper that I was meant to print on, and they yanked the rug out. And at that time, Kodak had an office in San Francisco, and a guy named Don Hilliker was in charge of it. And I knew him slightly. I called him up in an absolute panic and said, "You can't do this." And he said, "Well, not my call. I didn't want to do it, but he said, let me make some calls and see if I can find any of this paper for you." So called back a week or so later, and he said, "Well, there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is that no camera store in the entire North American market has any of this paper in stock, and nobody ever had it in stock. It was always a special order item." He said, "But the good news is there's a whole roll of it back in Rochester in the research department. Do you want it?" Yes. So I had a special garage sale of prints of people who collected my work. And they wouldn't give it to me. They were about to throw it away, but they wouldn't give it to me. I had to buy it. But I could specify how I wanted it cut and what sizes and whatever. So it cost me about $10,000. And I had a garage sale of prints and raised the money and printed on it for about 10 years until it started to fail a little bit. And then there were chemical fixes that could fix that. And then at some point, about 2016, 2017, even the chemical fixes didn't work. So I handed over what was left of it to Chris McCaw over there, who loves outdated papers.
It's the most beautiful surface of anything.
Yeah, and what I like about the Foma 532 is it's very similar to that surface. It's a different color base, but the surface became very important to me. Once I realized I loved that vellum paper, what I call vellum, Kodak's term for it was the letter A. That was the designation. But you know, growing up in the Ansel Adams School of Photography, the glossy print was the gold standard. And it's kind of a mixed metaphor. The silver print was the gold standard. it took me a little, well, actually, it didn't take me long at all once I realized I was in love with the vellum, that it doesn't have to be a silver print. In fact, I for the rest of my printing life, most likely, stay away from glossy papers. They just don't appeal to me that much anymore. Although I look back at the prints I made before 1991 and 2, and I love those prints. But that's because they were true to the time that I made them. Anyway, that's.
Talk for a moment, if you will, about your influences from other photographers and your influences not from photographers.
Well, from photographers, obviously Ansel Adams. I grew up in a Sierra Club family, so even before I was thinking like a photographer, there were Sierra Club bulletins, Sierra Club books, and Ansel Adams' name was obviously known to me. My folks also had a Cartier-Bresson book that I thought was really cool. I didn't know who Cartier-Bresson was, and I don't think I knew the title of the photographer's name until I became really interested in photography and then realized it was Henri Cartier-Bresson. But it was really Ansel Adams. And then in 1969, when I went to his workshop, he was very liberal about the photographers he exposed us all to. He was not at all dogmatic about his philosophy, how he likes things done. He gets that reputation because a lot of his disciples went out in the world and were very dogmatic about what they thought Ansel was dogmatic about. And he was not at all. In any event, with Adams, I was exposed to the work of Eugene Atget, the turn of the century and the early 20th century French photographer. I just thought, this is phenomenal. And then, and lots of photographers that all had a huge impression on me. Paul Strand, Edward Weston, on and on. But the one that had the most profound impression on me was Frederick Sommer. I saw the Frederick Sommer landscapes, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're these featureless, I mean, they're full of features, but it's almost a Where's Waldo kind of thing. You don't know what you're looking at. It turns out it's a mountainside with saguaro cactus or boulders or something, but it takes a while for it to register what it is, and it really doesn't matter what it is. And my reaction, growing up with the Ansel Adams School of Landscape Photography, my internal reaction was, I didn't know this was allowed. You can't make landscape photographs like that. You've got to have half dome sitting in the middle of it. Something you could point at and say, that's what this is a photo of. And those Frederick Sommer photographs, to this day, I just think are magical. And I became aware of the validity of the featureless. It's like, look, what just came to me right now.
How do you spell summer?
Pardon?
How do you spell summer?
S-O-M-M-E-R.
Thank you.
And then, as I became more literate with photography, a lot of photographers, like I mentioned, Henri Cartier-Bresson, that whole school of the humanist photographers has just always really moved me. My favorite of them is Willy Ronis, the French photographer. I met him, had a wonderful time with him. But that whole group, Elliot Irwood I mentioned, he's an American with that same kind of outlook. And it's sort of like me in drawing. I don't do that. I have taken pictures of people, but I can't do it. I'm not moved to do it the way those guys do, but I absolutely love it. And sometimes people make a mistake with me and with other people, particularly in a teaching or curatorial situation, is that they think I only really respond to the kind of work I do. And that's nothing could be further from the truth. I think my favorite all-time photographer is Sebastião Salgado, who's still with us and working. And nothing like my work. But in fact, every time I see a Salgado show, I live near a cliff. I want to take all my cameras, hurl them off, and just say, why do I even bother? Because there's a level of profundity there that is, it's like listening to Bach or something. You just say, well, okay, we'll never get there, but.
There was something you said to me about Salgado you described his work as poetry merged with geometry. You did.
Out of the mountain.
So I was having a little argument with myself. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah, just take it. So, speaking of Bach, what other non-photographic
well,
influences?
music, and Schubert is my absolute favorite. And it's sort of like, I had a friend from high school. There's no high school friend sitting here in this room right now. He probably remembers this guy, Oren Safir, who was a musician back then. And I had recently had occasion to get back in touch with him. I found him, and I wrote to him, and I said, you know, I know you were really big on Beethoven then, and I didn't care about Beethoven then, and we didn't care about anybody you were prattling on about. But I've come to love Beethoven. And I said, but I have to confess, I love Schubert even more. And he wrote back the most interesting response. He said, yeah, you know, he said, of course Schubert. He said that if somebody asks you who the greatest composer is, he says, well, the correct answer is Bach or Mozart or Beethoven. He said, but if somebody really presses you, you have to say, well, Schubert. He said, of course it's Schubert. He said, with Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, it's like they're showing you what they can do. And with Schubert, he's showing you what he found. And, you know, he was always, back in high school, he was, Drew can probably confirm this, he was always way out there. I mean, nobody knew what he was talking about. But it's like it sort of caught up with him a little bit, or maybe he slowed down to allow me to catch up with him. But it made so much sense, and that he shows you what he found. It relates so beautifully to what I do, to what all of us photographers do, because we're not manufacturing. I mean, we're manufacturing with print, but we're not manufacturing the raw material that went into it. We're finding that. And again, that's changing with AI, and there are photographers even before AI that created things in a way that I don't, so-called straight photographers don't. But for the most part, I find things, and I thought that was a kind of profound simile that we came up with. Anyway, well, just how that influences me is that I've never been moved by a photograph, whether it's Salgado or Frederick Sommer, like I've been moved by music. So I have to say that has influenced me more, and that it's taught me to feel more deeply, because I've never felt as deeply by looking at photographs as I have by listening to Beethoven or Schubert. Or for that matter, looking at a Rembrandt painting, because in Rembrandt, Vermeer, and some lesser-known artists like Georges Delatour, you see how they created the light. They're as conscious of, well, they're more conscious of light than the photographer is. Because the photographer, it's just that's their ink. It's there whether they're aware of its profundity or not. But a painter has to create it from scratch. And I just finished, I mean, it's hot now because of the Ken Burns thing on Leonardo, but I've done a lot of reading about Leonardo for years. And his awareness of light and how that's created on a two-dimensional, flat plane. The painter's awareness of light has had more profound influence on my own awareness of light than any photography.
I was thinking about Beethoven and Bach and Schubert, and humility is not a word I would ever associate with Bach or Beethoven, but certainly with Schubert. And there's so much humility in these photographs.
Well, like I said, I never had any aspiration to art. You know, but I got good at it, so, you know, people would see it, and I have one friend in particular who really championed my work, Marilee Page, some of you may have known. And so I thought, well, I mean, I got good enough just at the photography part of it that I knew I could make a living doing commercial work with photography, and I did architectural photography for many years. That I got paid for and delivered to clients, and they were happy, and I was happy. But it was never where my heart was. The book in back there called Parallel Landscapes, which is the sewage treatment plant, that was 90, 91, 92, 93. And it was at that point that I realized I really don't care about architecture. I don't really care about photography. But I had the skills of photography, and I was able to make them support me. But I really didn't care about, I mean, it didn't make any difference to me that it was a sewage treatment plant. And for the first 6 months I was photographing, I didn't even know what it was going to be. It just was this hole in the ground with all this interesting stuff going on. And I talk about that a little bit in the introduction to Parallel Landscapes. But I didn't care about the subject matter any more than I care about stools in the corner of a cafe or helmets on a wall in Yosemite. But there's some visual thing that happens that I respond to, and it makes sense to me. And whether there's meaning in it or not, I just sort of take it on faith. And you know, I don't know. It's just it continues to resonate with me, and that's my editing process. As soon as it no longer does, it gets in the scrap heap. And most of them end up in the scrap heap.
And the ones that don't are just really beautiful images that have these layers of resonance and these wonderful overtones. Your most current work has been in the botanical garden.
Right.
And how do you feel about the plants that you photographed over and over
Well,
and over again?
I'm about to have a show at the Botanical Garden, and plant people are very into their plants. And I don't really want it widely known that I don't give a damn about plants. I've said it in public, so it's weird.
You close the door.
I mean, I do. In the same way, I give a damn about rebar and concrete, which sounds blasphemous if you're a botanical person. But I mean, the Botanical Garden, well, let me put it this way. The construction site was a garden for me, as much as the garden is a garden for me. The things I'm photographing, the literal things I'm photographing in the garden will appeal to a lot more people than the literal things I was photographing in the construction site, because more people are into flowers and plants than they are into rebar and concrete. In fact, I don't know anybody who's into rebar and concrete.
There's a hand up in the
Yeah, a couple of
back.
hands. But I gotta say, I don't think it's for its own sake. It's for what it triggers in you. It's you know, it's all grist for the mill as far as I'm concerned. Just like stools in a cafe or a palm tree in my neighborhood on a foggy night. So, yeah, the Botanical Garden is wonderful, but a lot of the people who've seen the work says, "Why aren't you photographing in color? You know, you're photographing plants. Why aren't you color?" Well, I don't want to get too heavily into it, but for the most part, the color is green. Which I mean, it's as monochrome as gray, so you might as well go gray. Where you get flowers, okay, there's some color. And I do confess, I get seduced by the color sometimes, and I photograph in black and white, and I look at the photograph and say, no, doesn't do it for me. Well, it was the, you know, I still get confused. So the color is beautiful, and I say, wow, I got to take a picture of that. And then I look in. I always do a cell phone picture of everything I shoot on film at the Botanical Garden to put a timestamp on it, and also to make notes in the phone. Especially if there's a placard there by the plant, I can identify it right at the moment I shoot it. And then I go back and I look at the ones that don't work in black and white, and I say, well, yeah, the color one's really nice, but you know, I like a print of some of these color ones, and they just don't do it for me. It's the plant. It's about the plant, and I don't care about the plant. You know, it's like a picture of rebar. You know, somebody who, you know, maybe a steel manufacturer would say, "Oh, this is such a beautiful picture of rebar," and I'll just go, "I don't care." You know, and it's sort of like if I took a beautiful picture of a flower and somebody said, "You know, it's a beautiful picture." Well, I do care. I'm glad you think it's beautiful, but I don't really care that it's a beautiful flower. It's just, you know, it's all the creation is in it, and that's what appealed to me, not the fact that it's a dolly or whatever. So anyway, I digress.
So I was just continuing as you were saying, so we're not, the objects, whether it's rebar or Ruth Bernhardt nude, or the plans, it's not about the subject matter.
Yeah, you know, I mean,
Right, it's not about Aspen, Colorado.
right. It's like, to put it back to music, you know, it's like if I go to see a Mozart opera, I don't really care about the plot that much. And if I do find out what the plot's about, I think, now I'm distracted by that stupid plot. You know, I can't just listen to the music. You know? So yeah, the literal subject matter really is not that important to me. Now, like I mentioned, different hats at one point. When I was doing architectural photography, and you of all people would know because Reed was my assistant in that for several years. I had to care about the literal subject matter, and not just the literal subject matter, but my client's feelings about the literal subject matter, because I had to satisfy the client. And I could do that. I was facile enough with the camera, and pliable enough in my own attitude that I didn't have to do my own work when I was working for somebody else. And I didn't get work from a lot of architects because they thought that since I had this one foot in the art world, that I would insist on doing it my own way and not listening to them. And so I never had the client base that someone who's just exclusively an architectural photographer working for the big architects in the magazines. They would get. But the architects I've worked for never had a problem with that. Well, I shouldn't say never. There were a few mismatches, let's say. But you don't get rehired with them. So anyway.
Have you ever looked at an old print that you've done way in the past and then thought, maybe I could do something different with my experience now and make it into a different print?
You mean the same negative?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. And I'm thinking specifically of Morton Marcus, a teacher who we had, who was a poet, who would talk about putting something under the desk and then waiting a few years and then bringing it out again and rereading it and then, you know.
Well, let me re-answer that. Maybe, but when I see an old print I made, I don't have any old prints that didn't measure up at the time. So if it didn't measure up at the time, I do the same thing I do when they don't measure up now. I tear it up and throw it away. But that's the whole point of the sketchbook. That was what the sketchbook was about. It was to put things under a table for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and be able to come back to them. I don't feel like, for those of you who are photographers and maybe made contact sheets of your films, that never worked for me, because a contact sheet is for every, whether it's 36 pictures on a contact sheet or 12 pictures on a contact sheet, it's the wrong exposure for every one of them. You pick a medium that sort of gets you what you got in every single negative, but it's not a very good rendition of any of them. So I do this one each sketchbook print that was a good rendition. So I can go back and look at them. And I've done it many times over the years prior to Michael going through them. But it was a real treat watching somebody with Michael's visual literacy go through them. It was just fun to watch and to see which ones appealed to him, because I often don't know which ones are going to work. But when I look at the negatives on the light table back between 1995 and 2014 or so, the years I kept the sketchbook, any negative that looked interesting at all, I would make a sketchbook printout, which is the absolute opposite of how I edit for final presentation type things. In final presentations, I'm doing everything I can to eliminate pictures. In the sketchbook, I was doing everything I could to include pictures. So that this is a repository, it's this reservoir of all these ideas. I was just talking to somebody about my relationship to music, talking to you guys about it, how I don't think musically. And that's, no matter how hard I'd worked at music, I never would be good enough to satisfy myself on it. I think visually, and I'm very confident in my own visual response of things. I think visually, there's no lack of ideas. Every photograph in the sketchbook was an idea come to fruition, and there, as many are in the sketchbook, there's 10 times that I didn't get. The visual world is my book. It's what I read. And so,
I just want to say, having seen quite a number of Mark's images from the botanical garden, that despite you not being interested in the specific species and genus of every plant, there is a passionate commitment in those images to the life force and the way that different plants affect one another in their own environment, and how that is shaped by light.
yeah, and one of the reasons that I'm not into flowers is that I've gotten so distracted, for lack of a better term, with leaves and stalks. They're just, it's the, in the book, in the construction site book, there's a little, on the frontispiece page, there's a quote from Matisse which says, "There are flowers everywhere if you know where to look." Or if you know how to look, I forget the exact word. And it's a little too glib. I'm not going to do this when I do a botanical garden book, but I almost tempted to say there's architecture everywhere if you know where to look. Because the structure of those stalks and the leaves and the pattern of, I don't know what you call it, because I'm not a botanical person, the veins or whatever they are on the backside of leaves that you see, they're just, you've seen satellite photographs of desert areas or mountain ranges, and it's the same thing. There's this natural rhythm that all naturally forming things seem to reflect that is astounding. And that's another thing with Leonardo, that his drawings, he's acutely aware of that. And one of the amazing things about Leonardo, he's a fantastic drawer, no question about that, but it's the perception, it's the observation and realizing. He did aerial drawings of towns. He did them for, I forget the guy's first name, but one of the Borgias, who was a warlord and was killing everybody. And for a while, Leonardo worked for him, and he was laying siege to a town, and Leonardo drew him an aerial view of the town. Well, how do you do that? He first of all, his drawings of birds are fantastic, so I think he just channeled a bird and got inside a bird's brain and looked down on the town and said, okay, I'll just draw it, because the bird saw it, because he was from another planet anyway.
There's some more questions.
It's not a question, maybe a question, maybe a comment. My bias toward you was filtered through Diane, who said you're so serious. But you're not that serious. And I realized that what you're describing in the process, it doesn't matter what the subject is, you're really distilling it down to your own visual interpretation. So you have contrast, composition, and it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, there's a really funny picture of these little cable car things here. There's mugs,
Oh, yeah.
people's asses. I mean, what's that? And then something serious like Venetian blinds. I mean, there you go.
Well, you know, I appreciate that comment.
But it's composition.
I don't
it's-
think of
it's
myself
Mark
as
Rocco
serious
with the film.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. that's pretty fast company. You know, the prints, you know, that's photography. And I make that distinction between photography and the looking, the seeing, the noticing. Obviously, they're intertwined in the case of a photographer. The prints, whether they're ink or silver, the point's been made that they're all kind of similar. And it's, I've always maintained that printing is not a technical process. I mean, it is to a point that you learned it, but it's a reflection of your sensibility, and that's why it really doesn't matter to me ultimately whether it's an inkjet print or a platinum print or a silver print or a cyanotype or a particular process. As long as the photographer's sensibility is reflected truly, accurately, maybe not the right word, but faithfully, you know, that's all that really should matter. Because that's all that matters to me.
When you were working for commercial clients such as architects who wanted a specific thing that you had to meet, right? Separate from, I'll say, what you would notice on your own, how did you handle I noticed this on my own, but this is what my client wants?
Well, for the bulk of the years I was doing architectural photography, I did it with a 4x5 view camera. A material that was available throughout the life of my tenure as an architectural photographer was Polaroid film for the 4x5 camera. So if I saw something that the architect maybe hadn't thought of, I could do a quick Polaroid and say, what do you think of this perspective? Now, see, I would never claim to know a building better than its own creator, who's the architect. But I do have a way of spotting visual hooks. And an architect might not know what I mean, Julius Schulman, who's maybe certainly one of the great photographers, architectural photographers of the latter half of the 20th century, he made no bones about it. He'd say, architects are idiots. They don't know what they've got. And he was a little full of himself, but it was justified. He was really good. But he would be asked to speak at AIA conventions, and he would stand up there in front of all of them and say, "You're all idiots. You don't know what you're doing. You know, you got to hire someone like me to show you what you've done." So at the same time he's saying you're an idiot, he's saying you're brilliant, but you need me to bring it out. I would never be that arrogant, but I do think that my visual acuity to what's in front of me that's what I have to offer. So if an architect just wants me to render what he's already built, I'm not the right photographer for that. If they're willing to kind of do it as a collaboration, and my best clients were ones who did that, who relied on my take on things to include what they know they need, but to go that step further, which is individually my own. That's what, you know, if I did a job for an architect who wasn't looking for that, they wouldn't hire me again, probably. You had a question?
Follow up on that. Are you ever surprised by what other people see in your photograph?
Well, it's hard to say because a lot of times I don't know what other people see in them. I haven't been the recipient of a lot of specific comments about what they see in the photographs. I mean, way back when my work started getting people's attention, it was sort of a surprise to me that people liked it. I mean, it was a very pleasant surprise. And that's where you start getting thoughts of maybe making a career of something like this. If nobody liked it, it probably wouldn't have occurred to me to stay with it. And I just go back to seeing it and that be enough. But once you get kind of addicted, it's like heroin, you can't stop now.
Anyone else? Questions, comments, please?
Do you still carry your camera every day? And if so,
No, I wish I did. And the cell phone, goddammit, is probably responsible for that because I always sort of feel like, well, I've got it. I've got something. But in the introduction to that little book, the Modern Museum book, I talk about when I started carrying the Leica around, and I initially did it to make a quick shot of something that grabbed my attention, and then the intent was to go back with the 4x5 view camera and do it for real. And whenever I would go back, I mean, most of the time I wouldn't because you just never get around to all these things. But occasionally I would go back, and the one with the big camera, the one I considered the real camera, wasn't very good. It was that moment of seeing it that all the conditions were right, not the least condition of which is my own receptiveness. Just taking it down as a note and going back to that spot to try and recreate it, even if the sun's in the same position and everything, my mood is different. The whole thing is different. So I realized, well, I snapped it with the small camera. I've got it. What's this snobbery about? It's got to be a big camera. It's ludicrous. I mean, I've mentioned Salgado, Cartier-Bresson, Willie Ronis, all these people whom I worship use small cameras on the hip, shooting from the hip and on the fly. Why was I doubting it for my own work?
What you've said to me is that the view camera is important only if the photograph is about geometry.
Yeah, and I still like the view camera because, I mean, I've always felt that what's important about your selection of a camera is that it's the window you like looking through. And I give no credit to people who use an 8x10 view camera simply because it's a big camera and my commitment must be total if I'm using a huge camera like that. I mean, fine, it's a great exercise to learn to use any tool. It teaches you something.
It's a great exercise to carry it around.
Well, that's, pumping aluminum or whatever. But I don't really respect that as much as I do the attitude would be, I use the 8x10 because I love that picture window. Or I use the 4x5 because that's just the perfect size, the distance, whatever. It's a rhythm that you work comfortably with. If you see beautifully with a 20x24 Polaroid camera, then that's the camera you should use.
would you ever print an iPhone photo that you took if there was some
Well, I've tried, and
pictures?
I have an old iPhone, so it's not very good quality. So I do have some standards as far as technical quality.
Well, this one was taken with a point and shoot.
Oh, well, that's a really good point and shoot. I didn't like it ultimately because it was too slow to wake up and respond and click the shutter. I mean, I still use a Leica as my carry-around camera, and its responsiveness is instantaneous. The finger to the click is perfect. With the Lumix, it's like click, click. Yeah, made me crazy. If Cartier-Bresson had used that camera, it would always be the decisive moment +1. And there would be no Henri Cartier-Bresson. So,
You still have to advance the film.
right. Yeah, it's digital
It's not a
photography.
motor.
Yeah, you're using 2 digits. This one and this one.